Now, you might think that the secret to a great ear is the score, and while it's definitely part of the process, it's just a little link in the chain. To get your loaves to pop, each link needs to be really strong. If you break just one of them, the chain's going to fall apart. So before I show you the scoring, I'm going to walk you through the crucial steps that I took just to ensure that the dough was properly prepared before I scored it. Now, you can feel free to jump ahead and watch the scoring, but you may need to come back again when things go wrong. Right, so let's start at the very beginning. We're going to look at the recipe formula for a moment. Now, it's been carefully balanced. It's a combination of 90% strong white bread flour. We've got 10% whole wheat flour, and then we've got 70% water, and we wrap that up with 2% salt. Now, this creates a dough that's got enough elasticity to stretch and spring in the oven while being easy to handle and less likely to spread when I turn it out of the basket. Now, your goal should be exactly the same. You need to balance that hydration to create a dough that suits your skill level, choice of flour, and climate. The dough should feel supple, stretchy, and easy to handle. If your dough's sticking to your basket or it's spreading out while you're scoring, you need to make sure that you're using the strongest flour available and you're balancing the hydration to match. Now, you must make sure that your sourdough starter is alive and kicking. It's got to be actively fermenting. I don't want you to take any notice of Bill on Facebook. A strong starter isn't created in 3 days. It takes time, it takes patience. Make sure your starter is at least 2 weeks old, that it's been fed on a daily basis and it's been actively fermenting on each of those days. If it hasn't, just keep feeding it until it's nice and strong. Starters are like good wine. They tend to get better with age. A strong, actively fermenting starter is going to create a strong dough. If you use a weak starter, it's going to create a weak dough. It's as simple as that. Right, so our goal through bulk fermenting and proving is to prepare the dough correctly for baking. So let's look at what we're trying to achieve first by looking at the dough after we've scored it. Now, you can see that this dough kind of supports itself nicely, but it's also full of fermentation bubbles. Now, these bubbles, these are the key transportation route for the heat to travel through the dough during baking. As that heat passes through these bubbles towards the center of the dough, they expand, they burst, they set. That is oven spring. If you can't get your dough to this point, it is never ever going to spring correctly in the oven. Now, at 25 degrees Celsius, that's 77 degrees Fahrenheit, my dough takes around 5 to 6 hours to increase in volume by around 75%. Now, during that time, I add in a couple of laminations. Now, the stretching of the dough and the duration of the fermentation time really helps create this strong, actively fermenting dough. And once that dough is increased by about 75%, we can then move on. It's time to prepare the dough for the basket. Now, the goal during shaping is to shape the dough to fit the basket, but we're also creating tension in the dough. Then we can thoroughly bath it in rice flour before it goes into our basket, seam side down. Now the dough can be left at ambient temperature to prove. Now remember, we want that dough to expand to produce that thriving network of bubbles. Now, I've actually taken the time to size my dough correctly for my basket, so I know that for this recipe formula, my dough is sufficiently proved when it comes up to reach the lip of the basket. But you can also use the poke test to judge the proving stage. Knowing how to judge that bulk fermentation and the proving stage is an absolute art. It takes practice. The more you bake, the more you observe, the better the results are going to be. Right, so the very, very best results, you should retard your dough in the fridge after ambient proving. Now, I prefer to do this overnight as it gives me flexibility to bake whenever I'm free the next day. When you put your dough into the fridge, it's going to continue to prove a little as that dough cools down. Gradually, the dough is going to get colder and it's going to become more rigid or stable. This is great for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the dough is less likely to spread across the bench after you turn it out of the basket. Secondly, the dough is much easier to score when it's cold, especially if your kitchen is warm. Right, so our last job before scoring is to ensure that our oven is set up properly. Now, my setup of choice is a heavy-duty baking stone that's been preheated to 220 degrees Celsius That's 430 degrees Fahrenheit. Now my oven is set to bake mode. That delivers heat from the top element and the bottom element, but the fan is switched off. Now I slide my dough onto the stone using a peel, and then I cover it with a lightweight pot. When the dough's covered like this, I barely ever add any water or any ice to create additional steam. The stone transfers heat to the dough really quickly, and that pot traps the moisture inside, stopping the crust from setting too quickly and allowing that dough to spring to its full potential. Now, my loaves bake for 20 minutes covered and then around 20 to 25 minutes uncovered, depending on the colour. But I maintain that same temperature all the way through baking. Now, using a baking pan or a Dutch oven also produces great results. Now, after I've shown you the scores, I want you to tell me which one of them is your favourite, and if you haven't tried them, which one you're going to try first. Right, so this has got to be the easiest way to score your dough. So first of all, I dust the dough while it's in the basket, and then I gently rotate the basket to let gravity release the dough. I don't want it to get stuck as I'm turning it out of the basket. It gently goes down onto the peel, and as you can see, it holds its shape nicely. Now, holding that blade at roughly a 45-degree angle, I score through the dough at around a depth of 5 millimeters. Now, I want to go deep enough to allow that dough to open up in the oven, but not so deep that it opens up on the bench in front of me. I make sure the end is nicked so the dough can open up all the way. And then once you've scored the dough, the aim of the game is to get it in the oven as quickly as possible. You know, I guess this is always going to be one of my favourite scores as it produces that iconic Retard. It's got that stretched surface across the top of the loaf, and then you've got that lovely open ear. And inside you can see that roadmap where the heat has travelled through those bubbles. You can see where the cells have expanded and burst. And that's why I love the crumb of sourdough, because each loaf tells a different story. Right, so this one is a natural progression from the last. I hold the blade in the same way, using the same angle. I draw the blade back at the same depth, but this time I stop when I get about 2/3 of the way along the dough. I do the same thing, I nick the end, and then I spin that dough 180 degrees. Now I make exactly the same cut as I did on the other side. Now you want to make sure that these cuts are spaced towards the top of the dough, and you want to leave about 2 to 3 centimeters between them. Now don't delay after you make that first cut, otherwise your dough may open too much on one side and you kind of end up with a lopsided loaf. So speed is the name of the game. Now I'm always curious to see how the loaf has sprung when I take it out of the oven. And I think switching up the scoring like this really adds to the interest. Now when you've practiced this score a little, you can actually do it without rotating the dough. But you need to make sure your life's nice and easy at the beginning and practice it the way I've shown first. Right, so this one has to be one of my favourites, but it can be a little bit tricky because you want to ensure that as you cut with the blade, it's always angled towards the centre of the dough. So the easiest way to do this is just to rotate the dough halfway through like we did in the previous score. Now once you get experienced, it's easy to do in one motion. Now your first cut curves around the top of the dough and then it works its way diagonally down the centre while you keep that blade angled. You give the end a quick nick just to make sure that dough can open up properly. We're going to rotate the dough 180 degrees and now we simply follow exactly the same pattern, but as you draw that blade back down the centre, just ensure that it meets the previous cut cleanly. That's it. Slide it straight into the oven. Now if you want to try these, I suggest that you progress in the exact order that I've demonstrated. Start with the classic score, move on to the double straight score, and then finish with the S score. Don't forget, let me know which one was your favourite, and if you give any of these a whirl, tag me over on Instagram. I'll see you again very soon. Stay tuned.